Good evening. Tonight, we're settling in with the story of a man whose existence defied every reasonable expectation of survival. A man who turned chaos into art, madness into music, and somehow managed to outlive nearly everyone who shared his wildest adventures. His name is Ozzy Osbourne, though you might know him better as the Prince of Darkness. But before you picture leather and screaming crowds, imagine instead a confused, middle-aged man standing in his kitchen at 3 a.m, genuinely baffled by the coffee machine. Picture him asking his wife Sharon how to operate the television remote for the 1000th time, or having earnest conversations with his dogs about the state of the world. This is also Ozzy Osbourne, the man behind the myth, and perhaps the more remarkable version. Tonight's tale is not one of conquest or calculation, but of survival against impossible odds. It's the story of someone who lived so far beyond the boundaries of what a human body and mind should endure that scientists have literally studied his DNA, searching for clues to his inexplicable resilience. Most of us struggle with a single late night or one too many drinks. Ozzy Osbourne spent decades in a state that would have hospitalized ordinary mortals within hours. If you enjoy these sorts of stories of lives lived at volumes most of us can barely imagine, feel free to subscribe. And perhaps leave a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all scattered across the world, sharing these quiet moments with the ghosts of rock and roll. So dim the lights. Settle into something comfortable. And let us begin with a boy named John Michael Osbourne, born on a cold December morning in 1948, in a place where dreams were considered luxuries most families couldn't afford. Act Y. Birmingham, England, in the late 1940s, was not a city that encouraged whimsy. The air tasted of coal smoke and industrial ambition. The streets echoed with the clatter of factory machinery, and the horizon was painted in shades of soot and steel. Into this world of practical concerns and modest expectations came a child who would grow up to defy every assumption about where life might lead. John Michael Osbourne was the fourth of 6 children, born to Jack and Lillian Osbourne in a cramped terraced house on Lodge Road in Aston. His father worked nights at the local steel foundry, returning home each morning with blackened hands and the exhausted silence of a man who understood that work was survival, nothing more. His mother took in washing and mended clothes, her fingers perpetually stained with soap and dedication. The Osbourne household was not unkind, but it was not gentle either. Money was scarce, privacy was non-existent, and the future was something that happened to other people who lived in the better parts of the city. Young John, who would later insist everyone call him Ozzy, discovered early that he was different from his siblings, different in ways that would prove both blessing and curse. He struggled with dyslexia, though no one called it that then. Letters danced and rearranged themselves on the page like mischievous spirits. Numbers refused to behave. Reading was torture, writing was agony, and school became a daily reminder that his mind worked in ways the world seemed unwilling to understand. Teachers labeled him slow, disruptive, hopeless. His classmates were less diplomatic, but there was something else stirring in the boy, something that had nothing to do with arithmetic or proper spelling. When music played on the wireless, when voices sang through the static and scratches of their old radio, young Ozzy felt something shift inside his chest. The Beatles arrived like a revelation when he was 15, their harmonies cutting through the industrial gloom of Birmingham like sunlight through factory smoke. He would later describe hearing "She Loves You" for the first time as the moment his life changed direction. Not immediately, not dramatically, but like a river slowly bending toward a new course. Music, he realized, was a language he could speak fluently, even if English remained a struggle. Music made sense in ways that nothing else did. His first attempt at rebellion came early. At 17, he was arrested for burglary, a clumsy attempt to steal enough money to buy proper amplifiers for the band he was determined to form. The magistrate, perhaps sensing something redeemable beneath the sullen exterior, gave him a choice: join the army or go to prison. Ozzy chose a third option that wasn't officially offered. He ran. The jobs that followed were a catalogue of working-class desperation. He slaughtered cattle in an abattoir, the blood and screaming haunting his dreams for years afterward. He worked construction, his hands blistering and bleeding until they hardened into something resembling competence. He painted cars, tuned instruments, swept floors, and carried messages. Each job was temporary, each paycheck barely enough to survive, but all of it was leading somewhere, though he couldn't have said where. The transformation began in earnest when he met Tony Iommi, a left-handed guitarist who had lost the tips of 2 fingers in a factory accident. Most musicians would have considered such an injury the end of their dreams. Iommi fashioned prosthetic fingertips from melted bottle caps and learned to play with lighter strings tuned to lower pitches. The sound that emerged was darker, heavier, more ominous than anything anyone had heard before. They found Geezer Butler, a bassist with an obsession for horror films and occult imagery, and Bill Ward, a drummer whose rhythms seemed to channel something primal and unsettling. Together, they called themselves Earth, then Polka Tulk Blues Band, names that suggested they weren't entirely sure what they were becoming. The revelation came, as revelations often do, by accident. They were rehearsing in a damp basement across from a cinema that was showing horror films. One afternoon, Butler looked out the window at the long queue of people waiting to pay money to be frightened and said, "Isn't it strange how people enjoy being scared?" The observation planted a seed. If people would pay to be terrified by movies, perhaps they would pay to be terrified by music. They renamed themselves Black Sabbath, after a Boris Karloff film, and began crafting songs that sounded like nightmares set to rhythm. The music was heavy, not just in volume, but in emotional weight. It carried the frustration of factory work, the desperation of limited options, the anger of young men who had been told repeatedly that they didn't matter. Ozzy's voice became the perfect vehicle for this darkness. It could wail like a lost soul, growl like something inhuman, or croon with surprising tenderness when the songs demanded it. He discovered that his childhood struggles with communication had actually prepared him for this. When words failed him in conversation, they flowed like water when he sang. Their first album, recorded in a single day for the princely sum of £600, sounded like nothing else on the radio. Where other bands sang about love and sunshine, Black Sabbath sang about war, death, and the machinery that ground ordinary people into dust. Where other bands wore bright colours and smiled for photographs, Black Sabbath dressed in black and stared at cameras like they were preparing for battle. The critics were horrified. The churches were scandalised. Parents were appalled. And young people, particularly young men who worked in factories and felt forgotten by the world, bought the album in numbers that surprised everyone, including the band. Success, when it came, felt both inevitable and impossible. Here were 4 working-class boys from Birmingham, none of whom could read music, none of whom had studied their instruments formally, suddenly finding themselves on stages in front of thousands of people who sang along to every word. The transformation was so rapid, so complete, that they barely had time to understand what was happening to them. But success, they would learn, was its own kind of prison. The music industry had specific ideas about how rock stars should behave, and Ozzy, with his natural inclination toward chaos and his complete inability to conform to anyone's expectations, would prove to be spectacularly unsuited for the role he had accidentally auditioned for. The stage, however, was different. On stage, all of his restless energy, all of his inability to sit still or speak properly or behave like a normal person became assets. He could channel his anxiety into performance, his confusion into drama, his natural tendency toward the theatrical into something that audiences found magnetic. Night after night, in venues that grew progressively larger and more prestigious, Ozzy Osbourne learned that he could become someone else entirely when the lights went down and the music began. Someone confident, powerful, in control, someone who mattered. The problem, which would plague him for decades to come, was figuring out how to be that person when the show was over and the lights came back up. But that struggle was still ahead of him. For now, in those early days of Black Sabbath, when the future stretched out like an unmarked road and anything seemed possible, Ozzy Osbourne was simply a young man who had discovered that his voice, the same voice that had failed him in school and stumbled over ordinary conversations, could shake buildings and move crowds. He had found his calling, though he couldn't have known then what that calling would cost him, or how many times it would nearly kill him, or how it would eventually transform him into something far stranger and more enduring than anyone could have predicted. The boy from Birmingham was about to become a legend, though legends, as he would discover, are much easier to create than they are to live with. Act 2: Chaos and Fame. The transformation from struggling Birmingham musicians to international rock stars happened so quickly that none of them had time to develop the skills necessary for managing such a dramatic change. One day, they were sharing a single bag of chips between 4 people. The next, they were being driven to airports in cars longer than their childhood homes. The gulf between these two realities was so vast that it seemed almost inevitable that someone would fall into it. For Ozzy, fame arrived like a foreign language he was expected to speak fluently without ever having learned the vocabulary. Interviews became exercises in creative mumbling. Photo shoots turned into elaborate games of dress-up, where he was never quite sure what character he was supposed to be playing. Hotel rooms, with their pristine emptiness and identical furnishings, felt less like luxury than like expensive prison cells. The early tours were exercises in controlled chaos, though the control part was often questionable. Black Sabbath would arrive in cities they had only heard mentioned on the radio, climb onto stages that seemed impossibly high and bright, and perform for audiences that appeared to have been waiting their entire lives for exactly this music. The energy was intoxicating, addictive, and utterly exhausting. Between the shows, in the hours that stretched like empty highways, Ozzy discovered that being a rock star was surprisingly similar to being unemployed, except with better room service and more opportunities for poor decision-making. He had always been restless, unable to sit still, prone to filling silence with noise of any available variety. Now he had access to substances that could amplify that restlessness into something approaching mania. The drinking began as social lubrication, a way to ease the anxiety that came with being stared at by strangers in restaurants and having his photograph taken by people who seemed to find his mere existence fascinating. A few drinks before a show calmed his nerves. A few more afterward helped him come down from the adrenaline high that made sleep impossible. Soon, the few drinks had multiplied into something more systematic, more necessary, more dangerous, but it was on the stage that the real magic happened. The thing that made all the confusion and chaos worthwhile. When the lights dimmed and the crowd noise swelled and the first notes of War Pigs or Iron Man filled the air, Ozzy became someone else entirely. Someone confident, commanding, utterly present. He could prowl the stage like a caged animal suddenly released, his voice carrying over the thunderous instruments to the very back rows of the largest arenas. His stage presence was unlike anything audiences had seen before. Where other rock singers stood behind microphones and delivered their songs with professional competence, Ozzy treated the stage like a boxing ring, a confession booth, and a theatrical performance space, all at once. He would grab the microphone stand and swing it like a medieval weapon, drop to his knees in the middle of ballads, leap from amplifiers with the casual disregard for gravity that would later require multiple spinal surgeries. The audiences responded with something that went beyond mere appreciation. They screamed. not just with excitement, but with recognition. As if Ozzy was giving voice to feelings they had carried but never been able to express. Young men who worked in factories saw themselves reflected in his working-class swagger. Teenagers who felt misunderstood by parents and teachers found someone who seemed to understand that feeling perfectly. The mythology began to build around him almost accidentally. Stories spread from venue to venue, growing more elaborate with each telling. Ozzy had allegedly done something shocking in Cleveland, something even more shocking in Detroit, something absolutely unprecedented in Chicago. The specifics varied depending on who was telling the story, but the theme remained constant. Here was someone who operated by rules that seemed to exist only in his own mind. Some of these stories were true, some were exaggerated, and some were complete fabrications that Ozzy learned about by reading them in music magazines. He discovered that denying the false stories was less interesting than allowing people to believe them, and that his reputation for unpredictability was becoming as much a part of Black Sabbath's appeal as their music. The reality was often more mundane than the mythology suggested. Between shows, Ozzy could usually be found in his hotel room, watching television with the sound turned up too loud, ordering room service meals that he would forget to eat, or having lengthy conversations with himself about subjects that made perfect sense to him, but would have baffled anyone else who might have overheard them. The substances that were supposed to make everything easier began making everything more complicated. Cocaine, which promised clarity and energy, delivered paranoia and insomnia. Alcohol, which had once relaxed him, now seemed necessary just to function at a basic level. Pills that were meant to help him sleep kept him awake, and pills that were meant to wake him up made him drowsy. His body became a chemistry experiment conducted by someone who had never studied chemistry. Still, the shows continued, and the audiences grew larger. Black Sabbath's albums climbed the charts despite receiving reviews that ranged from confused to openly hostile. Critics who had expected rock music to remain within the boundaries established by earlier generations found themselves confronted with something they couldn't easily categorize or dismiss. The music was too heavy to be pop, too melodic to be noise, too serious to be novelty, and too successful to be ignored. By the mid-1970s, Ozzy had achieved something he had never consciously sought. He had become famous not just for his music, but for being himself, or at least for being the version of himself that emerged when all his natural inhibitions had been chemically dissolved. He was the rock star who might do absolutely anything at any moment, and that unpredictability made him both fascinating and frightening to the public. The other members of Black Sabbath watched this transformation with a mixture of admiration and concern. They had all signed up to be musicians, but Ozzy seemed to be evolving into something else entirely, some sort of performance art piece that happened to sing their songs. His behavior, which had once been merely eccentric, was becoming genuinely unpredictable. An unpredictability in a person responsible for entertaining thousands of people each night was not always an asset. The tension came to a head during the recording sessions for what would become their later albums. Ozzy would arrive at the studio hours late, if at all, often in a condition that made recording impossible. When he did manage to lay down vocal tracks, they were sometimes brilliant and sometimes incomprehensible, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to predict which version would show up on any given day. His bandmates began to discuss, quietly at first, and then more openly, whether Ozzy Osbourne the person was becoming a liability to Black Sabbath the band. They had created something together that was larger than any of them individually, but that creation was being threatened by the very person who had been its voice from the beginning. The end, when it came, was both inevitable and shocking. After years of mounting tensions, missed recordings, and performances that ranged from transcendent to barely functional, Black Sabbath made the decision that seemed impossible. They fired Ozzy Osbourne. The Prince of Darkness, the voice that had defined heavy metal, was suddenly unemployed. The news hit the music world like a small earthquake. Black Sabbath without Ozzy seemed as unthinkable as the Beatles without John Lennon, or the Rolling Stones without Mick Jagger. Fans were bewildered, critics were skeptical, and Ozzy himself was devastated in ways that went beyond professional disappointment. For someone whose entire adult identity had been built around being the frontman of Black Sabbath, suddenly not being that person anymore was like waking up in someone else's life. He had spent so many years being Ozzy Osbourne the rock star that he had forgotten how to be John Michael Osbourne the ordinary person, assuming such a person still existed somewhere beneath all the layers of performance and mythology. The months that followed his dismissal from Black Sabbath were perhaps the darkest of his life. He retreated to a small apartment in Los Angeles, drew the curtains, and embarked on what he later described as a systematic attempt to drink himself to death. Each morning brought a delivery of alcohol that was meant to last the day but was usually gone by noon. He stopped bathing, stopped changing clothes, stopped answering the telephone, and stopped pretending that tomorrow might be different from today. It was during this period of self-imposed exile that Sharon Arden entered his life, though entered might not be the right word for what was more like a rescue mission disguised as a business meeting. Sharon was the daughter of Don Arden, a music industry figure known for his aggressive negotiating tactics and his ability to spot talent that others had overlooked or dismissed. She found Ozzy in a condition that would have discouraged most people from pursuing any sort of professional relationship. He was, by his own admission, barely coherent, physically deteriorated, and emotionally shattered. But Sharon saw something that others had missed. Beneath all the damage and dysfunction was someone with a gift that transcended his personal problems. Their first meeting was less like a business negotiation than like an intervention. Sharon arrived at his apartment to find him sitting in the dark, surrounded by empty bottles and the debris of several weeks of determined self-destruction. Most people would have turned around and left. Sharon rolled up her sleeves and started cleaning. What happened next was part management deal, part rehabilitation program, and part miracle. Sharon didn't just believe that Ozzy could have a solo career. She was convinced that his solo career could be even more successful than Black Sabbath had been. This faith seemed so wildly optimistic that it bordered on delusion, but Sharon had a talent for seeing possibilities that others couldn't imagine. The process of transforming Ozzy from a washed-up former rock star into a viable solo artist was neither quick nor easy. First, Sharon had to convince him to stop drinking long enough to remember why he had wanted to make music in the first place. Then she had to find musicians who could not only play at the level his songs demanded, but could also handle working with someone whose behavior remained fundamentally unpredictable. The breakthrough came when they found Randy Rhoads, a young guitarist from California whose playing was technically brilliant, but who had been working in a music store because he couldn't find a band that shared his vision of what rock music could become. Randy was everything that Ozzy's previous musical partners had not been: formally trained, completely professional, and utterly dedicated to his craft. More importantly, Randy treated Ozzy not as a cautionary tale or a has-been, but as a serious artist whose best work was still ahead of him. This respect, coming from someone whose talent was undeniable, began to restore Ozzy's confidence in himself as something more than just a professional disaster. Together, they began crafting songs that were heavier than Black Sabbath had ever been, but also more melodic, more personal, and more theatrical. Ozzy's voice, freed from the constraints of band democracy, could explore ranges of emotion that had been impossible when he had to accommodate 3 other creative personalities. The result was Blizzard of Oz, an album that proved Sharon's faith had not been misplaced. It was darker than most radio-friendly rock, but more accessible than the most extreme heavy metal. It featured guitar work that was both technically dazzling and emotionally compelling, and vocals that demonstrated that Ozzy's voice had not only survived his years of abuse, but had somehow deepened and matured. But it was the live performances that truly announced Ozzy's return to relevance. On stage, backed by Randy's virtuosic guitar work, and freed from the need to share the spotlight, Ozzy discovered that he could be even more theatrical, even more unpredictable, even more magnetic than he had been with Black Sabbath. It was during one of these early solo shows that the incident occurred that would define Ozzy's public image for decades to come, though it lasted only a few seconds and was based on a complete misunderstanding. Act 2, Chaos and Fame, continued. Des Moines, Iowa, January 20th, 1982. A cold Tuesday night that would become part of rock and roll folklore, though not for any reason that Ozzy had planned or could have predicted. He was performing at the Veterans Memorial Auditorium midway through his Diary of a Madman tour, when someone in the audience threw what appeared to be a rubber bat onto the stage. Now, you have to understand that by this point in his career, Ozzy had developed a reputation for theatrical gestures that bordered on the absurd. He had bitten the heads off fake doves during record company meetings. He had urinated on historical monuments while wearing his wife's dress. And he had generally behaved in ways that suggested either complete fearlessness or complete detachment from conventional reality. So when he saw what looked like a prop bat lying at his feet, he did what seemed, in the context of an Ozzy Osbourne concert, perfectly reasonable. He picked it up and bit its head off. The problem, which became immediately apparent, was that the bat was not made of rubber. It was, in fact, very much alive, very much real, and very much upset about having its head removed by a man in leather pants. Ozzy's mouth filled with what he later described as warm, thick liquid, with a taste that no amount of beer or whiskey would ever completely wash away. The audience, who had expected theatrical mayhem, got authentic biological horror. Ozzy, who had expected to shock people with a bit of stage business, found himself being rushed to the hospital for a series of rabies shots that he would remember as being significantly more painful than the incident that had necessitated them. The story spread through the music press like wildfire, growing more elaborate with each retelling. By the time it reached the mainstream media, Ozzy had allegedly bitten the heads off multiple bats, possibly while suspended upside down from the arena rafters, possibly while reciting incantations in ancient languages that no one could identify. The truth, which was strange enough to require no embellishment, became buried beneath layers of mythology that Ozzy found both amusing and exhausting. For the rest of his career, which would span decades and continents and multiple generations of fans, Ozzy would be asked about the bat incident at virtually every interview. Journalists who should have been interested in his music, his creative process, or his thoughts on the state of the world would instead want to know how the bat had tasted, whether he had planned the whole thing, and if he had any regrets about eating something that had been flying around an Iowa auditorium. The incident became a perfect metaphor for Ozzy's relationship with fame. He had intended to create a moment of controlled chaos, something shocking but ultimately harmless that would give the audience a story to tell their friends. Instead, he had created an uncontrolled moment of genuine chaos that would follow him for the rest of his life, overshadowing his musical accomplishments and reducing his complex artistic persona to a single, grotesque image. But the bat incident, as bizarre as it was, represented only a tiny fraction of the daily reality of being Ozzy Osbourne during the height of his fame. The real challenge was not the occasional moment of theatrical excess, but the relentless, grinding pressure of being expected to be extraordinary every single day, in hotel rooms and airports and restaurants where ordinary people were watching to see if he would do something worth reporting. The substances that had once been recreational diversions became essential tools for managing this pressure. Cocaine provided the energy necessary to perform night after night in cities that blurred together into a single, endless venue. Alcohol dulled the anxiety that came with being constantly observed and judged. Pills helped him sleep in beds that were never quite the right temperature, in rooms where the air conditioning hummed with mechanical persistence, in buildings where the walls were too thin to block out the sounds of traffic and construction and other people living their normal lives. Sharon watched this chemical dependence develop with the clear-eyed pragmatism of someone who understood that the alternative to managing Ozzy's excesses was losing him entirely. She learned to read the signs that indicated whether he was approaching the functional level of intoxication that made performances possible, or the dysfunctional level that made them dangerous. She developed systems for ensuring that he ate food, wore appropriate clothing, and arrived at venues with enough time to prepare for shows that required precise timing and coordination. The tours became exercises in elaborate logistics, designed around the care and feeding of someone whose needs were both incredibly specific and completely unpredictable. Hotels had to be vetted, not just for their amenities, but for their tolerance of unusual behavior. Venues had to be scouted not just for their acoustics, but for their proximity to medical facilities. Travel schedules had to account not just for time zones and traffic patterns, but for the complex chemistry of substances that kept Ozzy functioning at a level that resembled normal human behavior. Meanwhile, the music continued to evolve in ways that surprised even Ozzy himself. Working with Randy Rhoads had unlocked aspects of his voice that he hadn't known existed. Randy's classical training and technical precision provided a foundation that allowed Ozzy's more intuitive, emotional approach to singing to flourish in ways that had been impossible during his years with Black Sabbath. Songs like Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley demonstrated that Ozzy's voice could be both powerful and nuanced, capable of conveying genuine emotion, even when the lyrics were dealing with subjects that most singers would have treated as pure theatre. When he sang about isolation, madness, or spiritual searching, audiences could hear in his voice the authority of someone who had experienced these things firsthand. The live performances became legendary not just for their scale and spectacle, but for their emotional intensity. Ozzy on stage was a different creature entirely from Ozzy in his hotel room struggling with the television remote. On stage, all of his restless energy, his inability to sit still, his need to fill every silence with noise, became assets that served the music and the audience. He would prowl the stage like something caged that had suddenly been released, his voice carrying over the thunderous instruments to reach the furthest corners of the largest arenas. The connection he made with audiences was immediate and visceral, based not on careful calculation, but on genuine emotional communication. When he sang, people believed him, even when what he was singing about was completely outside their own experience. But the cost of maintaining this level of intensity, night after night, month after month, year after year, was becoming increasingly apparent to those who knew him best. The man who could command the attention of 50,000 people for 2 hours each night was often barely able to maintain a conversation for 10 minutes during the day. The voice that could shake buildings became tentative and uncertain when he was trying to order room service or ask for directions to the hotel lobby. The contradiction between public Ozzy and private Ozzy grew more pronounced as his fame increased. The public version was confident, unpredictable, larger than life, capable of anything. The private version was often confused, anxious, dependent on others for help with tasks that most people handled without thinking. The gap between these two versions of himself became a source of constant stress, as if he was living two completely different lives that happened to share the same body. Randy Rhoads understood this contradiction better than most, perhaps because his own relationship with music was similarly complex. Randy was a perfectionist who practiced guitar for hours every day, who studied classical composition and music theory with the dedication of a scholar. But he was also someone who could channel that technical precision into moments of pure emotional expression that left audiences stunned. The collaboration between Ozzy and Randy produced some of the most enduring music of the early 1980s. Songs that combined technical brilliance with emotional honesty in ways that influenced countless musicians who came after them. But it also produced a friendship that provided Ozzy with something he had rarely experienced during his adult life: unconditional acceptance from someone whose talent he genuinely respected. Randy never seemed shocked by Ozzy's behavior, never seemed to judge him for his struggles with substances or his difficulties with ordinary social interactions. Instead, Randy treated him as a serious artist whose personal problems were separate from his musical gifts. This respect, coming from someone whose own musicianship was undeniable, began to restore Ozzy's confidence in himself as something more than just a professional catastrophe. The tragedy, when it came, was so sudden and senseless that it seemed to mock the very idea that life follows any sort of reasonable pattern. Randy Rhoads died in a plane crash in Florida in 1982, killed along with the pilot and the band's costume designer, when a small aircraft being used for a joyride clipped the tour bus and crashed into a nearby house. Ozzy learned of Randy's death while recovering from the previous night's show, still groggy from sleep and substances, initially unable to process what he was being told. The loss hit him with a force that went beyond professional disappointment or personal grief. Randy had been the person who had helped him believe that his solo career was more than just an elaborate form of professional suicide. Without Randy, Ozzy felt as if he was back where he had started after being fired from Black Sabbath, alone, uncertain, and increasingly convinced that his best days were behind him. The tour continued, because tours always continued, because thousands of people had bought tickets and booked hotel rooms and arranged their lives around the assumption that Ozzy Osbourne would appear on stage at the appointed time and perform the songs they wanted to hear. But the performances became exercises in endurance rather than expression, mechanical repetitions of gestures that had once felt spontaneous and meaningful. It was during this period that Ozzy's substance use crossed the line from problematic to genuinely dangerous. The chemicals that had once enhanced his performances now became necessary just to get him through each day. He was consuming quantities of alcohol and drugs that would have hospitalized most people, yet somehow continuing to function at a level that resembled professional competence. Sharon watched this deterioration with growing alarm, understanding that the man she had rescued from his post-Sabbath depression was now in danger of disappearing entirely into a haze of grief and chemical dependence. She began making plans for interventions, treatments, and career adjustments that might save his life, even if they couldn't restore him to his previous level of artistic achievement. But Ozzy Osbourne had always been more resilient than anyone, including himself, had any right to expect. Just when it seemed as if his story might end in the sort of predictable tragedy that had claimed so many of his contemporaries, he found ways to surprise everyone, including those who thought they knew him best. The next chapter of his life would be stranger than anything that had come before, involving television cameras, reality shows, and the discovery that the man who had terrified parents for decades could become, quite accidentally, one of America's most beloved father figures. Act 3. The unexpected domestic icon. The year 2002 brought something that nobody, least of all Ozzy himself, could have predicted. After decades of being known as the Prince of Darkness, the man who had bitten the head off a bat and scandalized parents across multiple continents, Ozzy Osbourne was about to become America's most unlikely father figure. The vehicle for this transformation was a television show that started as a simple documentary idea and evolved into something that redefined both reality television and Ozzy's place in popular culture. MTV executives, searching for content that would capture the attention of audiences increasingly bored with traditional programming, had heard rumors about the domestic life of the Osbourne family. The rumors suggested that the man who had spent decades terrifying authority figures was himself utterly baffled by remote controls, confused by modern appliances, and engaged in ongoing negotiations with his numerous dogs about household rules that seemed to change daily. What they discovered when cameras arrived at the Osbourne family home in Beverly Hills was something more endearing and more genuinely entertaining than anyone had anticipated. Here was Ozzy, the same man who had commanded the attention of stadium-sized audiences, standing in his kitchen at 2 p.m, wearing pajamas and arguing with a coffee machine that refused to cooperate with his increasingly desperate attempts to produce a simple cup of coffee. The show, which was initially titled The Osbournes, with the modest expectation that it might attract the attention of heavy metal fans and curious observers of celebrity culture, became something unprecedented. It revealed that the gap between Ozzy's public persona and his private reality was not just wide, but comically vast. The man who had once been considered a threat to Western civilization was shown struggling with tasks that most people mastered by adolescence. In one memorable scene, Ozzy stands in his driveway, holding a television remote control, pointing it at his car and pressing buttons with the genuine expectation that this might unlock the doors. When this approach fails to produce the desired result, he begins pressing the buttons more aggressively, as if the remote might be hard of hearing. His frustration is so complete, so childlike, that viewers found themselves feeling protective rather than superior. The show's genius lay in its complete lack of artificial drama. There were no manufactured conflicts, no scripted confrontations, no attempts to create tension where none existed naturally. Instead, the cameras simply observed the daily reality of a family where the father happened to be one of the most famous people in the world, but couldn't figure out how to operate the television in his own living room. Sharon, who had spent decades managing Ozzy's professional chaos, was revealed to be equally capable of managing his domestic confusion. She could be seen patiently explaining to him, for what was clearly not the first time, that the dishwasher required both soap and water to function properly, or that the dogs needed to be fed at regular intervals regardless of what time zone his internal clock thought it was operating in. Their children, Kelly and Jack, displayed the particular combination of affection and exasperation that characterizes most teenagers' relationships with their parents, except that their father's eccentricities were being broadcast to millions of viewers each week. They treated his celebrity status with the casual dismissal that only family members can manage, correcting his pronunciation of words he had been saying incorrectly for decades, and rolling their eyes at his attempts to understand technology that they had mastered without conscious effort. The family's numerous dogs became supporting characters whose personalities were as distinct as those of the human family members. These dogs, it became clear, had adapted to living with Ozzy by developing their own systems for dealing with his unpredictable behavior. They had learned to ignore his tendency to have lengthy conversations with them about subjects they couldn't possibly understand, and they had developed remarkable patience for his habit of forgetting that he had already fed them and attempting to feed them again. One of the show's most endearing recurring themes was Ozzy's ongoing battle with the various remote controls that seemed to multiply throughout the house like electronic rabbits. He would be discovered sitting in his favorite chair, surrounded by half a dozen different remotes, pressing buttons in combinations that followed no logic that anyone else could discern, occasionally achieving the desired result through what appeared to be pure chance rather than understanding. His relationship with modern technology extended beyond remote controls to include a comprehensive confusion about answering machines, cellular phones, and any appliance that required more than a simple on-off switch. Sharon had learned to anticipate these difficulties and had developed workarounds that allowed Ozzy to maintain the illusion of technological competence while actually operating in a carefully managed environment designed to minimize opportunities for electronic disaster. The show's popularity exceeded all expectations, drawing audiences that included not only Ozzy's traditional fans, but also people who had never listened to heavy metal music and had no particular interest in rock culture. What they were drawn to was the fundamental humanity of watching someone navigate ordinary life with extraordinary confusion, and the gentle comedy that emerged from the contrast between Ozzy's public reputation and his private reality. Critics, who had expected the show to be an exercise in celebrity exploitation, found themselves writing reviews that praised its authenticity and warmth. Here was a family that genuinely enjoyed each other's company, despite, or perhaps because of, their various eccentricities. The love between Ozzy and Sharon, which had survived decades of professional chaos and personal challenges, was evident in every scene, expressed not through grand romantic gestures, but through daily acts of patience and understanding. The show also revealed aspects of Ozzy's personality that had been overshadowed by years of media focus on his more theatrical behavior. His genuine concern for his children's well-being, his loyalty to friends, and his capacity for self-reflection became apparent to viewers who had previously known him only through newspaper headlines and music videos. Perhaps most surprisingly, The show demonstrated that Ozzy's confusion about ordinary life was not an act or an affectation, but a genuine consequence of having spent most of his adult life in environments where other people handled practical matters while he focused on performance. He had never learned to navigate the mundane world that most people inhabit, because he had rarely been required to do so. The success of the Osbournes created a new category of celebrity for Ozzy. He was no longer just a rock star or a cultural provocateur. He had become a beloved eccentric, a figure who inspired affection rather than fear. Parents who had once forbidden their children to listen to his music found themselves laughing at his attempts to understand why the television remote required so many buttons to perform what seemed like simple functions. This transformation was not without its complications. Ozzy had built his career on being unpredictable and slightly dangerous, qualities that seemed at odds with his new image as a bumbling but lovable patriarch. The man who had once been banned from entire cities for his outrageous behavior was now being invited to appear on daytime talk shows where hosts asked him about his favorite recipes and his opinions on household organization. He adapted to this new role with the same instinctive understanding of audience psychology that had made him successful as a performer. He seemed to recognize that people were drawn to his confusion, not because they wanted to mock him, but because they found it reassuring to see someone famous struggling with the same ordinary challenges that they face daily. The show ran for 4 seasons, each one revealing new layers of the family's dynamics and new examples of Ozzy's creative approaches to problem solving. His methods were rarely conventional and frequently ineffective, but they were always undertaken with a sincerity that made failure seem endearing rather than frustrating. As the show's popularity grew, so did public affection for Ozzy as a person rather than as a performer. He had achieved something that few celebrities manage. He had made people like him not despite his flaws, but because of them. His struggles with technology, his confusion about social conventions, and his obvious dependence on Sharon for navigation through ordinary life made him seem more human rather than less. The show's end in 2005 left audiences with a new understanding of who Ozzy Osbourne was beneath the theatrical persona he had cultivated for decades. He was revealed to be someone whose relationship with reality was genuinely unconventional, but whose capacity for love, loyalty, and unintentional comedy was entirely authentic. The years that followed brought new challenges that would test both his resilience and the public's affection for their unlikely domestic hero. Age, illness, and the cumulative effects of decades of excess began to exact their toll. But they also revealed new dimensions of Ozzy's character that even his family had not fully understood. Sharon remained his constant companion and interpreter, translating his needs to a world that had learned to love him, but still didn't always understand him. Their relationship, which had begun as a business arrangement and evolved into a partnership that encompassed every aspect of their lives, became a model of how two people can support each other through circumstances that would challenge any marriage. The dogs continued to multiply, each one adding to the household's complexity, while somehow also contributing to its strange harmony. Ozzy's conversations with them became longer and more philosophical, as if he had found in them the perfect audience for his thoughts about subjects that didn't quite fit into ordinary human conversation. His children grew into adults who carried forward both his creative instincts and Sharon's practical intelligence, proving that the combination of chaos and competence that had defined their household could produce remarkably well-adjusted human beings. They learned to navigate the world with confidence while maintaining the family's tradition of finding humor in situations that might frustrate less resilient people. The house itself became a character in the ongoing story of the Osbourne family, its rooms filled with the accumulated evidence of a life lived at volumes that most people couldn't sustain. Gold records hung next to family photographs, awards shared shelf space with dog toys, and the remnants of various technological battles served as reminders of Ozzy's ongoing struggle to understand the modern world. Through it all, Ozzy continued to be himself, which is to say that he continued to be genuinely surprised by the ordinary world while remaining completely comfortable with the extraordinary circumstances that most people would have found overwhelming. His ability to remain confused by remote controls while adapting to the pressures of international fame suggested a kind of selective competence that defied conventional understanding. The man who had once terrified authority figures had become an authority figure himself, though one whose authority was based not on intimidation or conventional wisdom, but on the accumulated experience of having survived circumstances that would have destroyed most people. His advice, when he offered it, was rarely practical, but was often surprisingly insightful, delivered with the authority of someone who had made every possible mistake and lived to learn from them. As the 2000s progressed, health issues began to accumulate like unpaid bills, each one adding to the complexity of daily life, while somehow failing to diminish his fundamental optimism about the future. He approached medical appointments with the same bewildered acceptance that he brought to encounters with new technology, trusting that others would handle the technical details while he focused on maintaining his essential Ozziness. The contrast between his public image and his private reality had evolved from a source of professional advantage into something more like a philosophical position. He had learned to inhabit both versions of himself simultaneously, switching between them as circumstances required, while never losing sight of the fact that they were both equally authentic expressions of who he had become. But even as age and circumstance began to impose new limitations on his daily life, Ozzy Osbourne remained fundamentally unchanged in the ways that mattered most. He was still the person who approached each day as if it might contain possibilities that no one had previously imagined. Still someone whose response to confusion was not frustration, but curiosity. Still, the man who had turned his inability to fit into conventional categories into a form of art that had influenced millions of people across multiple generations. The final act of his story was still being written, but it was already clear that it would be unlike any ending that anyone might have predicted for the boy from Birmingham who had grown up to become the most unlikely survivor in rock and roll history. Act 4. The Reckoning. Time, as it tends to do with those who have spent decades pretending it doesn't exist, eventually caught up with Ozzy Osbourne. Not all at once, like a sudden thunderclap, but gradually, like morning fog rolling in from distant hills. The man who had survived everything the rock and roll lifestyle could throw at him now found himself facing an opponent that no amount of stage presence or chemical assistance could defeat: his own mortality. The first signs were subtle, easy to dismiss as the ordinary wear and tear that comes with having lived a life at volumes most people couldn't sustain for a single evening. A tremor in his hands that made signing autographs more challenging than it used to be. A slight unsteadiness when walking that could be attributed to fatigue, or the lingering effects of decades of spinal damage accumulated through enthusiastic stage performances and less enthusiastic encounters with gravity. But by 2020, these minor inconveniences had assembled themselves into something that demanded a name, a diagnosis, a reckoning with the accumulated cost of having been Ozzy Osbourne for more than half a century. The doctors, with their careful explanations and sympathetic expressions, informed him that he had Parkinson's disease, a condition that would gradually rob him of the physical control that had once made him such a commanding presence on stage. The irony was not lost on him, though he was too tired to find it particularly amusing. The man whose career had been built on unpredictability now faced a future where his body would become unpredictable in ways that served no artistic purpose. The tremors that had once been theatrical gestures would now be involuntary reminders of a nervous system slowly losing its ability to follow his commands. Sharon watched this development with the practiced calm of someone who had spent decades managing crises that would have overwhelmed less experienced crisis managers. She approached Ozzy's diagnosis the same way she had approached his substance abuse problems, his legal troubles, and his periodic attempts to redesign the laws of physics through creative interactions with stage equipment, as a problem that required practical solutions rather than philosophical contemplation. The house in Beverly Hills, which had once been a setting for televised domestic comedy, was quietly retrofitted to accommodate new realities. Handrails appeared in strategic locations, as if they had always been part of the interior design scheme. Floors were cleared of obstacles that might present tripping hazards to someone whose relationship with balance had become more negotiated than automatic. The dogs, with their uncanny ability to sense changes in household dynamics, adjusted their behavior to provide additional stability and companionship. Ozzy's daily routine, which had never been particularly conventional, evolved to accommodate the new requirements of managing a condition that affected everything from his ability to walk across a room to his capacity for maintaining conversations with people who weren't dogs. The morning meetings at Alcoholics Anonymous, which had been part of his schedule for years, now served the additional purpose of providing structure for days that might otherwise dissolve into confusion and frustration. The 90-minute workout sessions in his home gym became less about maintaining the physique of a rock star and more about preserving whatever physical function remained available to him. Exercise, the doctors explained, could slow the progression of his symptoms, though it couldn't stop the inevitable decline that lay ahead. So Ozzy, who had never been particularly interested in conventional approaches to health maintenance, found himself on treadmills and exercise bikes, listening to music through headphones and trying to remember what it had felt like when his body responded immediately to his intentions. The contrast between his current circumstances and his previous lifestyle was so vast that it seemed to belong to different centuries rather than different decades. The man who had once consumed enough substances to stock a small pharmacy now counted pills that were designed to help rather than hinder his brain's ability to function. The performer who had once stayed awake for days at a time now structured his schedule around the need for regular sleep and consistent meal times. But perhaps the most significant change was in his relationship with silence. For someone who had spent most of his adult life surrounded by noise, amplifiers, crowds, televisions turned up too loud, conversations conducted at volumes that assumed everyone was partially deaf, the quiet moments that now filled his days required a different kind of adjustment. He discovered that silence, when it wasn't being used to fill the space between songs or the pause before a dramatic entrance, could be surprisingly comfortable. His conversations with the dogs, which had always been lengthy and philosophical, became even more elaborate as he found himself with more time to contemplate subjects that didn't require responses from anyone who might judge the logic of his observations. The dogs, for their part, seemed to understand that their role in the household had evolved from providing comic relief to offering genuine companionship to someone whose world was gradually becoming smaller and quieter. The music industry, which had once demanded his constant attention and presence, learned to accommodate his new limitations with the sort of respectful distance that is usually reserved for elder statesmen and recovering patients. Recording sessions were scheduled around his good days. Interviews were conducted when his voice was strongest, and public appearances were planned with the understanding that they might need to be cancelled if his symptoms made them inadvisable. Yet even as his physical capabilities diminished, something else seemed to emerge from the constraints imposed by his condition. The man who had once relied on theatrical excess to capture and hold audience attention discovered that he could achieve similar effects through subtlety and timing. His voice, when he chose to use it, carried the weight of accumulated experience in ways that no amount of volume could have provided. The awards and honors that came his way during this period felt different from the recognition he had received during his more chaotic years. These weren't celebrations of his ability to shock or surprise, but acknowledgements of his influence on multiple generations of musicians and his unlikely survival of circumstances that had claimed many of his contemporaries. He accepted them with the bemused gratitude of someone who had never expected to live long enough to be considered a legend, much less a beloved one. His relationship with Sharon, which had begun as a business arrangement and evolved through romance, partnership, and shared crisis management, now took on aspects of a long-term care plan administered with love rather than obligation. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether he was having a good day or a difficult one, and she adjusted her expectations and schedules accordingly. Their conversations, which had once focused on tour dates and recording schedules, now covered subjects like medication timing and physical therapy appointments. The children, now adults with careers and lives of their own, visited with the particular combination of affection and concern that characterizes adult relationships with aging parents. They brought grandchildren who were too young to understand why Grandpa Ozzy moved more slowly than he used to, but who seemed to accept his eccentricities as part of the natural order of family life. These visits provided glimpses of normal family dynamics that had been largely absent during the years when Ozzy's career had dominated every aspect of household scheduling. The house itself seemed to settle into a quieter rhythm, as if it too had learned to accommodate the new pace of daily life. The rooms that had once been settings for television cameras and interview crews now served primarily as spaces for reading, television watching, and the sort of ordinary domestic activities that most people take for granted. The gold records and awards remained on the walls, but they felt more like historical artifacts than ongoing reminders of active career obligations. Medical appointments became regular features of the weekly schedule, each one providing updates on the progression of his condition and adjustments to treatments designed to maintain his quality of life for as long as possible. The doctors, who had initially approached him with the sort of cautious fascination usually reserved for medical curiosities, gradually came to appreciate his pragmatic acceptance of circumstances beyond his control and his ability to find humor in situations that might have devastated someone with less experience managing the unexpected. The interviews he gave during this period carried a reflective quality that had been largely absent from his earlier public statements. When asked about his legacy, his influence on music, or his thoughts on mortality, he responded with the sort of thoughtful consideration that suggested someone who had finally found time to think about questions that had previously been answered with theatrical gestures and provocative sound bites. He spoke about his surprise at having survived circumstances that had killed many of his friends and contemporaries, not with the swagger of someone who considered himself invincible, but with the bewilderment of someone who had never quite understood why he had been lucky when others had not. The graveyard, he observed, was full of people who had lived less dangerously than he had. Yet he remained confused by his own persistence and grateful for time he had never expected to have. The music he listened to during his quieter moments revealed tastes that had been overshadowed by his public image as the Prince of Darkness. Classical compositions, jazz recordings, folk songs that his mother had sung when he was young. These became the soundtrack for hours spent in comfortable chairs, watching the California sun move across familiar rooms while dogs slept at his feet, and Sharon moved through the house managing the practical details of their shared life. His voice, when he used it for singing rather than conversation, retained the power to move listeners even when it no longer possessed the range and strength that had once filled stadiums. The emotion that had always been the foundation of his appeal as a performer remained intact, perhaps even enhanced by the vulnerability that came with age and illness. When he sang now, it was not as the Prince of Darkness, but as someone who had seen darkness and chosen to keep singing anyway. The fans who had followed his career for decades seemed to understand this transformation instinctively. Their letters and messages, which Sharon read to him during quiet afternoons, expressed not pity, but gratitude for the music, the memories, and the example he had provided of how someone could survive circumstances that seemed designed to be unsurvivable. They wrote about concerts they had attended, songs that had helped them through difficult periods, and the comfort they found in knowing that someone who had lived as chaotically as Ozzy had managed to find peace in his later years. The dogs, ever present and increasingly important as companions, seemed to sense the changes in household rhythms and adjusted their own behavior accordingly. They became more attentive, more patient with his slower movements, more willing to spend long periods simply sitting near him while he read or watched television, or stared out windows at the garden that Sharon tended with the same careful attention she brought to every aspect of their shared life. As the seasons changed and the years accumulated, Ozzy Osbourne settled into a version of himself that few people, including himself, could have imagined during his wilder decades. He remained fundamentally himself, confused by technology, devoted to his family, prone to lengthy conversations with dogs about subjects that would have baffled human listeners. But he had learned to inhabit this identity at a volume that allowed for reflection, rest, and the sort of ordinary pleasures that had been impossible when his life was conducted at maximum intensity. The man who had once bitten the head off a bat, who had scandalized parents and thrilled teenagers, who had survived everything the rock and roll lifestyle could offer, had become something even more remarkable. Someone who had learned how to age gracefully while remaining essentially unchanged in all the ways that mattered most. He was still Ozzy, still surprising, still somehow managing to find new ways to be himself, even as the circumstances of his life continued to evolve in directions that no one could have predicted. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer frightening, filled with possibilities that were quieter than those that had defined his earlier years, but no less meaningful for their reduced volume. He had learned, finally, how to be Ozzy Osbourne at a sustainable pace, and the world had learned to love him, not despite his limitations, but because of his remarkable ability to remain himself under any circumstances.